Hello, hello, and welcome to the first Scholars Hub at Home session of the new year. I'm Allison Gampel, Associate Director, Alumni Engagement at York University. Thank you so much for joining us for today's lecture, Eating as an Art of Connection, with Associate Professor David Goldstein from the Department in the Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. I'll begin with our land acknowledgement. Since we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that I might not acknowledge the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory you're on and the current treaty holders. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for this. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have longstanding relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. Before we introduce our speaker today, I'd like to share that the 2021 President's Report was recently published and made available. This report highlights how York has continued to advance the university's priorities set out in the 2020 to 2025 academic plan. The report showcases how we are strengthening our impact on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and driving positive change locally and globally. It's a comprehensive update, and you can read the full report at yorku.ca/President's Report 2021. Now, we like to conduct a quick poll before we launch each lecture. So today's question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? The poll's just popped up, and I'll give you each a moment to respond. Fantastic. So by now we're all quite used to Zoom, but if you do need any help this Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We have a team that's ready to help. That same button, the Q&A button, can be used to submit questions for our guest speaker to be answered during the Q&A period that will follow the presentation. Please do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and staff working behind the scenes, so we ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. So on to today's talk. Today we are featuring Dr. David Goldstein. David serves as an associate professor of English and coordinator of the creative writing program here at York. His first monograph, Eating and Ethics in Shakespeare's England, shared the biennial 2014 Shakespeare's Global Book Award. Professor Goldstein is also a former restaurant critic and food magazine editor who has published 3 co-edited essay collections on subjects involving Shakespeare, food, and hospitality, as well as 2 books of poetry. We are so pleased, David, that you could join us today, and we welcome you to turn on your camera and join us on screen.
Hello. Thank you so much, Allison, for that generous introduction. And it's such a pleasure to be here today with everybody. I'm really looking forward to talking about this.
Fantastic. So I'll let you share your screen and I will see you after your talk.
Great, thank you. Does that work for everybody?
It does. Go ahead.
Great, great. Okay, so eating as an art of connection. We're trained, it seems to me, by the entire Western tradition to think of food as a thing, as a discrete object that we can measure and absorb. We talk about calories, we talk about nutrients, we talk about ingredients, we discuss our culinary preferences and poisons in terms of the substances that comprise our food, whether it's vegan or gluten-free or organic. And I'm not saying this isn't extremely important. Obviously, you know, if you're celiac, you need to know whether something has gluten in it. It's not about a relative value here or a questioning of whether it's important to know what's in your food. It's rather the way in which we as a society talk about these issues. We put tremendous emphasis on the question of what we're eating. We very rarely think about how we're eating, why we're eating, in what context we're eating. That's not the way that our societal discussions about these issues tend to go. We learned how to think about food as a what from, among other sources, Plato. And Plato's always, he's an easy punching bag, but in this case, he is quite relevant to the conversation. In the Gorgias, which is one of the founding texts for Western philosophy's attitudes towards food, Socrates describes eating and drinking as nothing more than satisfying a need like itching and scratching or any other simple pleasure or requirement. Food for Socrates is a matter of inputs and outputs, a basic biological function devoid of philosophical interest. In the Phaedo, considering the approaching end of his life, Socrates waves aside matters of consumption altogether, taking it as a given that the philosopher should not, quote unquote, concern himself with the so-called pleasures connected with food and drink. Socrates arrives to Plato's Symposium, which is another one of the founding texts of Western philosophy, late, about halfway through dinner, and is indifferent to whether there will be drinking involved at what is expected to be a drinking party. I mean, a symposium in ancient Greece was you sit around and you drink and you have snacks, and that's the major focus. And Socrates comes on saying, why are we even doing that? The talk is what matters. The talk is what's going to give us the energy we need. He professes the wish that, quote, wisdom were like water, flowed by contact out of a person who has more into one who has less. He's teasing his friend Agathon, but beneath that metaphor lies the dream that philosophy could do away with the need for material sustenance altogether. If only we could just think and talk all day and not worry about constantly filling and refilling these leaky vessels that we call our bodies. So Plato's vision of food as a physical thing has influenced Western culture in countless ways. Such suppositions are ubiquitous in today's attitudes towards eating. In the United States, where, as Claude Fischler has shown, he puts it as eating has become more individualized and medicalized. Our views have progressed even further along this path to the point where diners are now most likely to describe their meals, according to Fischler, in terms of nutrients, carbohydrates, fats, proteins, not foods, end quote. And I would say, and I might talk about this later in the Q&A, that that trend is a little bit less advanced in Canada than it is in the United States, but as usual, we're a kind of the US is a kind of bellwether for trends that are also happening, but maybe we're a little bit behind the curve, in this case, in a good way, in terms of how this works. Modern science has thus accelerated an atomization of Western eating that has progressed for centuries. Meanwhile, mounting scientific evidence suggests that thinking about food exclusively as an object contributes to a range of unhealthy eating practices, including obesity and other forms of dysregulation. It's true that part of the problem of our current food system lies in the quality of the ingredients that make up much of the packaged food in our stores and quality control around those issues. But as urgent a problem is that we consider food to be a thing made up of ingredients in the first place. Those packages list by law what each food is made of, but they don't indicate how or with whom we consume each food is just as important for our health. Absent from this empirical model of food is the recognition that we do not just consume food, we eat it. And eating is not simply a biological phenomenon, it is a social one, even if one is eating alone. Food is relational. It doesn't stay in one place, one form, or one body, it circulates. First, through ecological transformations that start with soil, plants, and non-human animals, and then through relationships with other people. Food constitutes a material trace of the biological, ecological, social, and symbolic interactions that link eater, eaten, and the macrocosm that surrounds them. Many of the relationships that food marks, and which I tend to talk about, fall under the term commensality. And it's nowhere near as popular a term as culinary or culinary, as some people pronounce it. It's when I talk about commensality, even scholars are like, what? Never heard that term. And so that in and of itself seems to me really striking, because commensality, which is derived from the Latin commensalis, with the table, means eating together. Narrowly then, commensality refers to the social aspects of the meal. And the remarkable fact that we have a word for that and nobody uses it, to me, is striking. More broadly, however, commensality describes the range of relationships that emerge and are fixed and reified through the act of eating. These relationships, which York University's own Penny von Esterich describes as commensal circles, begin with the placental transfer of nutrients between mother and fetus, expanding steadily outward through ever wider eating communities, whose largest circle is the non-human world that grows and becomes our food, and to which we return as food. Commensality is food in its relational aspect. It is eating conserved as a network or as a principle of connectivity. Literature has always been exquisitely attuned to commensality, even if Western philosophy notably has not. And this is because literature is always concerned with social relationships and with larger webs of connection. In the same period that Plato was dismissing eating as mere biology, for example, Socrates' contemporary and Symposium interlocutor, the comic poet Aristophanes, was using food to frame his masterpiece of political satire, The Knights. Excuse me, my cat has just arrived and is saying hi. Let me get back to my screen here. Let's see, the play, first performed in 424 BCE, is a vicious attack on the Athenian demagogue Cleon, who had recently ascended to power and whose name you may have heard because a lot of scholars have compared him to Donald Trump over the last few years. Capitalizing on the vulgarity of Cleon's leadership style and heritage, he was the son of a tanner, a profession with very little social status. Aristophanes stages a contest between the Paphlagonian, which is the Cleon character, and a sausage seller, whose profession carries even less prestige. The two of them battle for the affections of an old man named Demos, which means the people, as in democracy. At the play's climax, both the Paphlagonian and the sausage seller ply Demos with food and drink, but the Paphlagonian is exposed as a fraud at the end of the meal. Opening Cleon's basket, Demos reveals piles of food that Cleon has withheld from the people. Good heavens, cries Demos, it's full of good stuff. Look at all these cakes he stashed away, and he only gave me a tiny slice. This greedy hoarding of food by the ostensible leader of the Athenians constitutes a grave insult to good governance. Here, Aristophanes imagines the civic body as a feast at which the good host shares all. If the host shortchanges or disrupts the commensal relationships that bind the polis or the city to itself, he fails to conduct the affairs of state with virtue. So commensality becomes a metaphor for political organization. As the sausage seller proclaims at the end of the play, I'll cherish you and nourish you, the people. The trope of the governor as mother or head of household partly originates in these early commensal conceptions of civic community. And let me just point out again that Aristophanes is a character in the Symposium. He was known to Socrates, they were close friends, Plato knew him. And it's really interesting to see these two different figures, one of whom cares not a whit about food, and the other one places food as central to the exact same kinds of questions that Socrates and Plato are asking. So it really has to do, I think, with the difference between how Western philosophy developed in how Western literature and drama developed. And so then it's through Western literature and drama that we can start to see these things that philosophy and other disciplines tend to mask. Number 2, eating prepositions. If literature has long attended to commensality, literary criticism, blinded by the biases of philosophy, has only recently begun to explore its importance. Just as criticism began to address the role of sexuality in imaginative writing only after Freud and others showed the way, literary critics are now following in the footsteps of the social scientists regarding food. Sociology and anthropology are founded in part on analyses of religious, ceremonial, and to a lesser extent, everyday commensality. Over the course of the past century, these disciplines have developed a nuanced vocabulary for examining commensal dynamics. But this vocabulary, as we'll see, is not always appropriate to the needs of literature. Literary critics need to forge ahead with our own taxonomies in order to more accurately explain how food works in and among texts, and therefore to contribute most fully to a broad understanding of eating relations. But by the same token, social science perspectives are limited in their ability to take account of how eating relations function, not just socially, but ethically, intellectually, symbolically, imaginatively, and creatively to help constitute the human. By this, I mean that our conceptions of ourselves and of our relationships to the non-human, or in Stacy Alimo's terms, the more than human world, as expressed through food, are undergirded by certain specific conceptions of language and the imagination. Literary studies is among the best equipped to uncover and articulate these conceptions. So commensality provides a key model for understanding eating relations in literature and in other forms of imaginative writing, while literary criticism can bring to bear important insights on how eating works both in social theory and in the praxis of lived experience. I'm going to give you an example of that. So social science tends to categorize commensal events based on the sort of meal under study. So for instance, an informal family meal is considered differently from a communal or religious feast. These categories, which are often grouped under the terms domestic, kin and communal, ceremonial and religious, political, and hospitality, can help clarify the circumstances of commensality in a given text, but they're ultimately of limited use in a lot of ways. And this is because when you look at literature, commensality takes place as in real life, yes, in particular social contexts, but literary scenes of meals and metaphors of food and drink are usually constructed in order to point beyond and beneath the particular to the symbolic and material foundations of human relations. So in literature, commensality tends to look more like this. Everything overlaps. From a writerly point of view, the correlations among different acts of commensality are usually at least as compelling as the conditions of a single food interaction. So any scene or mention of commensality articulates both a specific set of interactions and an insight. It kind of blows it open into a general or metaphorical connectivity. So let's go back to the Knights, but think about it in sociological terms for a moment. Aristophanes presents a domestic feast that demands to be read as a political allegory, the intersection of which brings an ethical message to bear on the play's depictions of kin, community, and hospitality networks. Finally, the play was produced in a religious context. It was first performed at the Lanaya, a festival celebrated in honor of Dionysus that involves rituals of sacrifice and wine mixing. And we should actually pause to say that all drama, or almost all drama, in ancient Greece was produced first in a ritual and religious setting, which changes the way we think about drama and its origin in the Western tradition. So I think it's less productive to categorize Aristophanes' play as one or another kind of commensality based on the particular situation of the central meal than it is to examine the way the play uses commensal ideologies to comment holistically upon domestic, communal, political, and religious facets of Athenian life, all in order to make one powerful point about how Athenians should conduct themselves as citizens in the fullest sense of human relations. So that's what literary commensality can do. It can activate the network and kind of make us realize how interactive all of these ways of thinking about eating are, and that they, whereas social science tends to kind of hive them off, literature brings them together, and it's the bringing together that we can analyze to sort of understand the human and the human relationship to food in a broader way. Literary commensality becomes even more complex when we turn to an instance of language that doesn't even denote a proper meal in any ideological sense. So let's consider how the groundbreaking modernist writer Gertrude Stein addresses the issue in her Cubist masterpiece, Tender Buttons. Probably the most famous sentence in the book, which itself takes up an entire section and which describes the relationality of food with admirable economy, is this one: roast potatoes 4. So that's an entire poem. Yes, there's nothing after that, that period. Roast potatoes 4. Here we've got no coherent depiction of a meal, just a fragment. Stein focuses our attention not on a particular set of relationships, but on the role of language itself in forging and articulating those relationships. Roast potatoes, this fragment suggests, are not only themselves, they're always for. They're for something, they're for someone, they have a purpose, and the purpose is inherently social. They point beyond themselves towards language, towards cultural and biological networks, and towards people. The object presupposes a preposition, a grammatical term that positions objects in relation to each other. There are no roast potatoes without for. So you could argue that roast potatoes can be for straightforward biological nourishment and may not necessarily indicate a social interaction. I'm going to push on the distinction between the social and the biological anyway at the end of the talk, but I would say that the passage's larger context mitigates against such a bounded reading. The general rhetorical action of Tender Buttons tends away from the social and away from an exclusively biological conception. So for example, the opening of the whole section, roast beef, starts with the social. In the inside, there is sleeping. In the outside, there is reddening. In the morning, there is meaning. In the evening, there is feeling. In the evening, there is feeling. Other sections in this, or other poems in this section, emphasize meal preparation. So for example, the poems around roast potatoes, in the preparation of cheese and the preparation of crackers, you get a social interaction, or the asparagus in a lean-to, asparagus in a lean-in, a lean-to hot, recalling the lean-to that sort of was one of the first shelters of humankind. So I think that Stein understands very clearly that, as the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas puts it, food is not the fuel necessary to the human machine. Food is a meal. Stein's potatoes are for the meal, for the generation of meaning. Okay, so let me move quickly to the question of inclusion and exclusion. Commensality is often equated with conviviality, but they aren't the same thing. Commensality is the simple fact of relationships that connect eaters. Conviviality is the social pleasure of taking part in those relationships. But commensality, as anyone who has participated in an uncomfortable holiday dinner, and probably that's all of us, can attest, it doesn't always produce social pleasure. In fact, some of the most interesting meals in life and in literature are difficult, dangerous, even downright violent. The banquet scene in Act 3 of Macbeth, at which Macbeth continually witnesses the ghost of Banquo sitting in his seat while his wife frantically tries to reassure her guests that their king is not losing his mind, provides a case in point. The scene offers a study in the collapse of conviviality through the performance of commensality. It's the climax of the play's emotional arc, not a failure in terms of the play, but a great tragic success. The scene reminds us that meals, speaking in evolutionary terms, are always charged with risk. Here's a group of people, often armed with knives, tearing into other organisms with their teeth. What holds them back from eating each other? Only in the final analysis, a delicate web of fellow feeling, social graces, taboos, rules of etiquette that stretch back into our cannibal primate past. Literature finds power in disjunction, the disjunction between eating a meal together and enjoying it, or between eating with the other and eating the other, is one of its great sources of lyric and narrative engagement. A related truth of eating relations is that any meal integrates some people while excluding others. Most meals experienced in everyday life emphasize inclusion over exclusion. Those sharing a family dinner typically do not call attention to the families who are not invited. But the boundary is always present, and literary accounts of eating tend to be strongly drawn to the contrast between those who partake and those who only peer in the window, or in fact lie motionless in the snow. The anthropologist Mary Douglas writes, "It's disingenuous to pretend that food is not one of the media of social exclusion," end quote. Literature doesn't pretend, it loves that fact. This is perhaps literature's most striking insight into commensality, whereas everyday life often ignores the role of eating in keeping the in-group in and keeping the in-group in and the out-group out. In fact, it is in some sense predicated upon the ignorance of this distinction. But literature, with its bird's eye view of human interaction, is constantly reminding us of those barriers and boundaries and exclusions. In fact, one of its chief ethical purposes is to do so. Okay, I had another section on table ecology, but I'm moving more slowly through this material than I had planned. So I'm going to kind of put that on the shelf for now. Maybe we can talk about it in Q&A, because I think I've covered a lot of what I wanted to say. I'll just leave you with this quote from the Taittiriya Upanishad from the 6th century BCE, which maintains, "Food is spirit. From food all things are born, by food they live, towards food they move, and into food they return." And I'll also leave you with one shot at the end here, and you can ruminate on that as we start our Q&A. Hold on one sec, it just jumped out. There we go. Okay, so let me turn it back over to Allison. I look forward to your questions and comments.
Fantastic, well, David, thank you so much. This was so interesting and informative and made me think about literature and food and learn so many new terms. You know, the questions are endless. So thank you for sharing your work with our community. We truly appreciate it.
It's such a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So to our audience, for the Q&A period, I'll ask any questions that you have on your behalf. So if you could just type them into the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, I can read them out and then David can give us a response. But I think we have to start here by asking, it looks like Harry Potter on the screen. You know, why Harry Potter? And is there a commensality in Harry Potter? Is there a connection? Tell us more.
Well, I think you can see the commensality right there. Yeah, I mean, I've actually written a fair amount about Harry Potter because, you know, one of the things that I didn't talk about in this talk was children's literature. But if you think about it, children's literature as a genre focuses an enormous amount of energy on food. It's very hard to find works of children's literature that don't mention food at all. And I think that's partly because food looms really large in the imagination of childhood. Kids don't have, first of all, you know, kids aren't fully sexual beings, so they're not really focusing on that so much. And certainly children's literature doesn't tend to. But they are really from a very early age, from their first day of life, working out their relationship to food, and sort of more largely then, as with everybody else, their relationship to people, their relationship to the non-human world. And so that's one of the major conduits that they move through. So children's lit is really good and really interesting about kind of presenting scenes like this. And Harry Potter's no different. You know, the first book opens with Harry being presented with this scene of what I would call bare commensality. He's forced to cook the breakfast that his host family is going to eat. And then he's only allowed to sit there and have the dregs of it. You know, Dudley gets all the good stuff, and he's like sitting in the corner, not allowed to talk, not allowed to communicate at all. He's there, but he's almost fully excluded from the experience, even though he's helped cook it, right? And then the first inkling you get that Harry's destined for something else is when Hagrid appears at their at the little island hut that Dudley's father has taken them to escape these messages from Hogwarts. And Hagrid bursts in with the birthday cake and sits down with Harry and eats that birthday cake. And now the other people are excluded from that meal. And so you get this kind of dynamic of like the Muggles have their commensality and now the wizards have their commensality. And the way in which Harry gets slowly but surely integrated into the new wizardic commensality gives you almost all the information you need to know about the way in which the narrative is going to shift over the next 8 books to focus on him. And so this scene I've showed of him, you know, finally sharing a meal with just another kid, you know, who of course becomes his best friend on the train on the way to Hogwarts, kind of sets up, you know, all of what's going to happen in at least the first few books. Then it gets a little more complicated.
It's so interesting. And, you know, it makes me think about, you know, real life. You know, my children right now are having lunch at school, and because of the pandemic, they're sitting together at table groups, but they're not allowed to talk to one another.
Mm-hmm.
Just sort of curious about, you know, aside from literature in real life, right, how that changes the dynamic when conversation doesn't come along with, you know, with the commensality piece.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been thinking a lot about the way in which the pandemic is impacting this. I mean, we've certainly seen over the last several months I wouldn't say showdown, but increasing tension between medical and governmental authorities saying our focus is we have to limit the spread of this disease, and social and psychological experts saying, okay, but there's a limit to what the human consciousness can handle before it becomes more of a problem to before mental and social health are impacted more greatly than physical health is being impacted now by the disease. So that that's a very complicated balance, and I think that it does emerge in how commensal relationships are navigated by individuals and also mandated or controlled by governments or by school authorities, for example. So, you know, it's so important that kids are sitting together at lunch and having whatever social interactions they're going to have, because this is a foundational way in which they're going to start to interact with the world. And if we're not allowing that to happen, we'd better have a really, really, you know, good reason for doing that, right? And so that, I think, is what governments and experts are trying to balance when they negotiate these issues.
Absolutely, thank you. So we have Heather in the Q&A who has said, not a question, but it's interesting in writing and film what we infer about the emotional states in a communal dining situation. For example, those who eat with gusto, or those who just push their food around but don't eat, those who abruptly stop eating and push their food away, etc. Any thoughts on Heather's comment?
Oh yeah, I think that's great. And it you know, it shows how, you know, I mean, any kind of small detail in a film or a story is usually there to tell us something about character. And food is no different from that. But I think what's interesting is the kind of lexicon of ways in which we interpret all of those all of those details we see, and a lot of those details tend to be cultural. So for example, I'm always fascinated by the fact that, for example, in France, the term gourmand just means somebody who loves food and is passionate about food. It has no negative connotation. But once it gets translated into English, a gourmand is seen as somebody who's like eating for the sake of eating and kind of forgetting about society or other people or health in the process. So in a French film, you might see somebody, eating away with gusto and have no negative connotation around that. Whereas in an North American film, you might see that and be kind of prepared to judge that person negatively as somebody who's too focused on themselves, right? And you see a lot of those kinds of depictions in North American and British movies, far more of them than you see in French films. And I think the same is true in literature.
Fascinating, thanks for sharing. To our audience, we have about 5 minutes left for questions. So if you do have any burning questions, feel free to type them in. I would like to ask if you can elaborate more about commensality in literature, how that opens into questions about ecology and the environment. Are there literary texts that show this?
Yeah, so that's something that I didn't really address towards the end there, but it's what I'm ultimately really, really interested in, is the way in which our discussion around environment and ecology does not really ever tend, I don't know about ever, but most of the time does not tend to kind of incorporate commensality. When we talk about food and the environment, we're almost always talking about the way in which, our eating has environmental impacts. So should we be eating, the classic one is, should we be eating meat or should we be eating vegetables? And that's discussed entirely in terms of how much damage it does to the environment and how much it accelerates climate change. It's not talked about in terms of, when we sit down to eat, how do we create community? How do we bond ourselves to each other? How do we think about the ways in which human eating and human interaction kind of develop alongside caring for the environment and a kind of stewardship of the environment, or an understanding that we are just one node in the environment, right? Even thinking about stewardship means that we're thinking of ourselves as separate, but we're not. We're just part of the whole environmental matrix. And I think really taking that seriously is a challenge that thinking about food through the lens of commensality can help us with. Because really, in a way, the just about any organism is what the philosopher Donna Haraway calls a messmate. It's sitting and eating with us, or it's eating, sometimes it's eating us, right? I mean, the current thinking about COVID could even be framed in a kind of negatively commensal way. Like, here's a virus that's eating us, right? It's using us as a host. We're being very hospitable, whether we like it or not, bouncing from one person to the other and kind of dining on and in us, right? And thinking of ourselves as the food source for them is a little bit alarming, but it's not biologically inaccurate, right? So there are literary texts that kind of point to this in strange ways. For example, one of my favorite poems of all time is Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, 14th century English romance that just thinks about all this stuff, 600-700 years ago. It's already thinking it through. So there's a scene in which there's a scene that almost cinematically, and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight was just made into a movie, The Green Knight. But unfortunately, the people who made the movie have no interest in this issue. So it doesn't really appear anywhere in the movie, but there's a scene where you get these interspersed scenes of humans, Sir Gawain and his hosts, eating meals, interspersed with animals being hunted and then butchered. And a lot of scholars have been like, why are these two things connected? But I think they're connected because the poet is trying to tell us, you can't just think about the meal, you have to think about what goes into the meal. And the animals that are butchered provide the meal, but they're also symbols for the human interactions in the whole poem. So it's a very concise way of showing how the eating and the larger themes and the larger connections and the larger networks are all tied together in that poem and in society in general.
Sure, absolutely. And to add on to the connections, Heather wrote another note that I'll share, and says, as a woman who's responsible for preparing and serving food daily to family members, I'm interested to find how personally I take it when my food is declined. It's a mixture of anger, offering an effort seemingly rejected, and alarmed, some sort of maternal urge to nurture that never seems to die out. This dynamic clearly goes beyond an objective exchange.
Yeah, I have that too, because I'm also mainly the cook and provider for my family. And when they don't like something, I'm like, I take it personally, and it becomes not just about the food, it's also about the emotional and social interaction, for sure.
Yeah, well, you certainly, my 14-year-old has taken to cooking herself, and she's still learning. And when you started saying, what we're eating versus the how and why we're eating, and I think about, how do I want to respond to what? I'm usually focusing on, do you have all of your food groups, right? But she's preparing it for the family, and that's a whole different context that I think is important.
Yeah, totally.
Recognize. So
yeah.
She's cooking dinner tonight.
Yeah.
I'm going to end with a final question that's coming from Wayne. Wayne asks, why do you suppose European dining etiquette tends towards stiff rule-based consumption, which tends to stifle children's interaction?
I do think that's interesting. I wouldn't be too general about all European dining etiquette, because I think it varies from culture to culture in terms of how, having eaten with a lot of families, let's say in Italy, especially Southern Italy, I find that doesn't always hold true in Italian cuisine, for example. It certainly tends to be more true in French and Northern European cuisine. However, even there, I think it's a double-edged sword. I'd say in general, that's because European etiquette in general, or European culture in general, especially Western and Northern European culture, tend to be more kind of reliant on rule following, rule making, rule binding, just in a very general cultural way. Whereas North American culture, because it's a more kind of mosaic / melting pot / immigrant culture, has over time really it was partly founded in order to get away from the old world. So I think it's a little more complicated in the way in which those interactions developed. That said, I think that it doesn't always just stifle children's interaction. I think it's meant to kind of teach them a whole set of attitudes around food. So for example, in French daycares, often, and yes, in Quebec too, with its French influence, often, little kids will be served full course meals, and they're expected to sit there for the 3 courses and eat and comment on the food and enjoy the food and have conversations about the food, right? This is not something that I see very often in non-Francophone daycares in Canada or in the US or in the UK. So yes, there's a constriction there, but there's also a focusing. There's a focusing on the food, and there's a focusing on the commensal interaction. So I think some things are lost, as always is the case in terms of cultural dynamics, and some things are gained. And maybe that's part of the reason why, French culture is historically more interested in and attuned to the way food works in a societal setting. And Anglophone cultures tend to be a little less conscious of that, right? Or focused on that. But again, that's a huge generalization. We're talking about millions of people. So I wouldn't stand by that as a specific individual comment. I would stand by it though as a very vague generalization about how these things tend to work. Great question though, really interesting.
Absolutely. Well, that takes us to the end of the conversation, and so so much to think about. And I feel like everyone that's taken the time to be here with us today will just bring a sort of mindfulness and thoughtfulness to their next meal, if it's lunch or if they're eating during this presentation. I'm guessing that our
Which
minds.
I hope you were.
Yeah.
I hope you
So,
were
yeah.
eating.
So David, thank you so much for being with us today, for sharing with us this really interesting work and research. And with that, I'll let you turn off your screen and wish you well.
Thanks to everybody. Thank you so much, Allison, for facilitating this wonderful experience. I'm really glad that the Scholars Hub exists, and thanks to all of you who were here. I'm sorry I can't see your faces and actually talk to you, but I really appreciate your presence. So thank you so much. Bye.
Wonderful. Thank you. And I'll just end with a few closing remarks. For those of you who would like to share today's session with your family and friends, it'll be posted on our YouTube page at youtube.com/YorkU alumni. And you can also watch past lectures that you may have missed. Before we say goodbye to our audience, we do want to ask one additional poll question. So the question is, and I think I know how it's going to go, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion? So it has popped up on your screen. I'll give you a moment to respond. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for participating. Let's see if the responses pop up. I know I certainly learned a great deal. In terms of what's happening next, the Scholars Hub will return in 2 weeks on Wednesday, February 2nd, with Danielle Howard, Associate Professor in the Theater History and Dramaturgy, and her session is titled Dance and Feet, Harlem and Basketball in the 1920s to 30s. And 2 weeks later, with Professor Shao, Associate Professor of Organization Studies, and the topic is Reactions to COVID-19 News Overload and its Impact on Work. You can register for the next Scholars Hub or any of our events at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. Thank you all so much for joining us today, and we wish you well.